Time and Place by GingerBaggins, Chapter 5, Time Heals Some. Draco spent most of the next day setting up his brewing station and storeroom, feeling like he was floating. This was more than he'd ever imagined for himself. When he was a boy, his future had been about strategic and political alliance, arranged betrothals, and estate management. He'd not allowed himself aspirations beyond the Wiltshire manor, and he'd not minded at all. It was of course what he'd been bred for. Keep the line wealthy and keep the line pure. Sanctimonia Vincit Semper. After his 6th year, and the permanent symbol of his misplaced allegiance which remained to this day, he'd never imagined he would be able to indulge in anything as light and fulfilling as a dream. He was to remain on a leash for the rest of his adult life, and he had deserved no less. But by that point, his world has changed so thoroughly that the thought of doing nothing more than managing wealth he did not acquire filled him with nausea. His mastery was never intended to be anything more than self-fulfillment, a way of keeping sane, of proving to himself that he was capable of more. And yet here he was, a temporarily unspeakable, with his own potions room. Granger had shown him to the Potions Association storeroom the day before, as promised, and the sheer scale of it had almost knocked the wind out of him. It was just as large, if not larger, than the library at the manor, though it lacked the same stench of dark magic. She'd left him to make a list of everything he wanted brought down to the DOM while she stepped outside to speak with someone in what sounded to him like a hushed argument. His curiosity piqued, but he knew better than to push his luck as soon after acquiring it. She'd made good on her promise not to hover and kept mostly to herself, poring over papers and diagrams that Draco could not make heads or tails of. She seemed to be incapable of settling, pacing around the study as she read, pouring repeated cups of coffee, the smell of which made Draco feel queasy, occasionally pushing the time turner under a spotlight and examining the casings. She left the office more times than he could keep track of, mostly to check the clock in the hallway, and other times on ventures that he was not privy to. She returned in the afternoon with a chaise, which Draco had forgotten about, floating behind her. She lowered it into the corner of her room and offered him a somewhat triumphant smile. "What do you think?" she asked, looking sly. The chaise was old and well crafted. The fabric looked soft and the cushioning inviting, but his lip curled at the garish colorway of red and gold. He should have known. Granger looked beyond pleased with herself, and he wouldn't have doubted for a second that it hadn't only recently taken on those colors. He waved his wand and turned it a deep shade of emerald before smirking back at her. "It's perfect." She placed her hands on her hips. He laughed. Her eyes fell on a large box he'd brought in from home, filled to the brim with books, most of which he acquired during his studies. She let out a low gasp at the sight, taking an involuntary step towards them before catching herself and looking up at him to ask permission. Granger was a beautiful witch. He'd been aware of that fact for some time now, but never more so than in that moment, near vibrating with pure excitement over old textbooks. "Go wild, Granger," he said, catching as she dove for the box, started pulling each book out with gentle hands. She held each one as though it were something precious, and he watched with a growing sense of reverence and tranquility. He tried to remember when he'd last been that delicate with something. He couldn't think of anything sooner than when he'd first gotten his wand. That rush of magical connection was unmatched by any one he'd held since, particularly not the ministry-appointed one he'd been working with for the last 6 years. It worked fine, it just wasn't his. "Oh, I love this one!" she exclaimed, holding up his weathered copy of Most Potent Potions. "I used it to brew Polyjuice Potion in the 2nd year." "You brew Polyjuice Potion in 2nd year?" "To varying success," she shuddered, and he suddenly had 1,000 more questions. "I managed to convincingly turn Harry and Ron into Crabbe and Goyle, though the hair I thought I pulled from Millicent's in our brawl turned out to be from her cat. He felt his mouth open and close so many times before he could find his voice. You must know how insane everything you just said was. I'm surprised you haven't heard that story 1,000 times by now. It's one of Ronald's favorites, she mused, attention still stuck on the book and not at all aware of how thoroughly she had just spun him out. Why did they need to be Crabbe and Goyle? To speak with you. We were convinced you'd open the Chamber of Secrets. He blanched. What? She chuckled heartily, and it pierced through the ringing in his ears. I know it all sounds rather silly now, doesn't it? Second year, gods, he remembered that time well. His father had spent all summer poisoning his mind with comments about their superior blood status, and he'd brought it back to Hogwarts with him. The woman before him now, smiling gently at his books, was the first person he'd ever thrown the word mudblood at. He'd never forget the way her face had fallen when he'd said it, how stung she had looked despite standing her ground. Nor would he forget the twisted sense of satisfaction he had gotten from knowing how proud his father would have been had he witnessed it. What did I say to them? He asked quietly. She shrugged. You wished death upon the Muggle-born students, particularly me. Then you unknowingly confirmed that you were not the heir of Slytherin and sent us back to square one. I hid in the toilets while they were with you, but the potion didn't wear off when it was supposed to. I was furry for weeks. He felt sick. He was going to be sick. He needed to apologize. He had to know how miserably fucking sorry he was. I can see you gearing up for another apology, and I'll beg you not to bother. Marlin, she missed nothing. The confirmation hit him with the force of 1,000 curses. Hermione Granger would always be the brightest, most brilliant witch. She'd be the girl who brewed Polyjuice Potion when she was 12, who fought dark wizards throughout her entire teenage years, who'd somehow found the kindness to offer him a chance at life that he would never deserve. And he would always be Draco Malfoy, the little prick who wished her to die. Hermione, do you know they published an updated version of this last year? She cut in, waving the book. Very difficult to come by. Though being somewhat famous has one or two perks. They sent me an advance copy. I'll bring it for you tomorrow. It could be useful for your work. You can't give me a book, he choked out. Every time she spoke, she kicked his shame up a notch. She looked at him then, eyebrows raised, not a hint of the animosity she would have been overflowing with. Why not? I can't take a gift from you. He'd wished for her death for Merlin's sake, and now she was offering him a book? Are you being serious? Very. She let out a disbelieving breath, and he wondered how he was still managing to say the wrong thing after all these years. All right, no gift. I'll bring the book in, seeing as it is my office, and should you so happen to look at it in pursuit of our shared goal, I will never say a word about it. He said nothing. He could say nothing. She was right, as usual, that the book could come in handy in the near impossible task he was about to embark on, and he'd be a liar if he claimed that he'd not been searching for a copy of it for months. The alarm blared from the other room, and Granger rolled her eyes before pushing herself back onto her feet. It'll be time for lunch. Harry and Ron want to get Ty. Are you in? Like hell. He had too much to organize, too much to process, too much to dwell upon. No, thank you. I think I'll just get finished up here. Suit yourself. She spun on her heel and made her way towards the office exit, throwing a parting glance over her shoulder as she went. Check the clock outside at least once while I'm gone. He merely nodded in agreement, and then she was out of sight. He let out a deep, shuddering breath and pressed his palm flat against his chest. He could not panic now, not so soon into the professional partnership. This was unlikely to be the last time their history became a conversation, and she had every right to bring it up. 100, he whispered, squeezing his eyes closed. 99. 98, 97, 96, and so he continued, counting for the whole hour that she was gone. He did not check the clock as she'd asked, and he did not unpack his boxes like he promised. When she returned, she did not come to see him, opting instead to settle at her desk and focus on her diagrams. Baklava. Draco paused mid-chew and looked over to where Theo sat, hands resting on the back of his head, leaning back in his chair, as though he'd not already repaired the legs of it at least 3 times. Not for the first time, Draco felt a pang of longing for that hand-carved and structurally immortal furnishing of the manor. He finished chewing before he responded because he was not an animal. What? Bring her a baklava. I saw one in the window of a bakery this morning and it looked divine. I'd forgive just about anything to get my hands on a slice. Your head must be such an interesting place to live, Draco muttered, turning his attention back to his plate. I don't think pastry is going to be an adequate showing of remorse. Well, she clearly isn't interested in your words, Theo shrugged. I am aware. Maybe you should just move on. His hat shot back up to find Theo's careless little smirk. This was not the first time that he had brought up the idea of Draco moving beyond his apologies, nor was it the first time Draco had squashed the idea. It was all very well for Theodore not to move on when he didn't carry the reminder of every misdeed in the form of a brand. For Draco, there was nary a day that passed without his arm twinging with the phantom sting of the mark forever etched upon it. I'm just saying that it might not be about you, Theo pressed, ignoring the curl of Draco's lip with practiced ease. She's focused on the job at hand. Whatever it may be, she doesn't need some self-pitying oaf wallowing in the corner. She needs a colleague, right? Theo had a point. Not that he'd admit it out loud. Tell me, did you accept the job with the sole purpose of getting her to forgive you? No, he snapped. Not the sole purpose. Is she treating you like an adversary? No, she's been more than fair, he huffed. In fact, the only time she had shown any sign of genuine animosity was when he'd stupidly tried to get his apology out again. In the week that they had spent working together in the little office, she'd seemed mostly comfortable in his presence. He'd shown her the outline of his plan to deconstruct and reconstruct the ingredients of aging potions, and she'd thrown him a quick, whatever you think is best, and turned back to her work as though she hadn't just flipped his stomach into knots. She always poured him a cup of coffee when she refilled her own, which was terrifyingly frequent. And she always invited him to join her, Potter, and Weasley for lunch. So far, he'd always refused. It seemed like she's moving on, so should you, Theo finished, the legs of his chair slamming back down on the floor, much to Draco's horror. Don't scratch the fucking floors. Sensitive, he mumbled and pulled a packet of cigarettes from his breast pocket. Don't smoke in the fucking flat. Dictator. Draco shot him a warning glance, which went utterly and entirely rebuffed. He'd not been all that close with Theo during their school days. Though, from everything he had since learned, it turns out no one was all that close with Theo in those days. But since their fathers had taken to each other in their shared hatred of all things, they had taken to each other in shared hatred of their fathers. Lucius Malfoy was a cold, cruel, and unyielding bastard whose disparity and insecurity dragged his whole family to the wrong side of a vicious war. But he did, despite the rest, love Draco and Narcissa in the only way he could. He'd done his very worst deeds in pursuit of their survival. It was cowardly, but it had worked. Cowardice was something Draco inherited from his father, along with his thankfully now shed belief in blood supremacy. Yes, Lucius wasn't a particularly wonderful father, but he was still Draco's father. Theodore's father was a malicious, violent piece of work. No one knew that more than Theo himself, who had spent the better part of his life on the receiving end of his outbursts. There had been a reason Theo had gone out of his way to go unnoticed at school. Fear that someone might see, might question, might write home to his father, after which he would be torn away from the only solace life had offered him. Draco knew this about Theo. He cared for him and empathized with him more than almost any other person in his life. And yet, he still took enormous pleasure in hooking his foot under the leaning leg of the chair and giving it a push. Theo's arms shot out to catch himself at the table, mock betrayal breaking out over his face, an unlit cigarette hanging loose from his lips. "And you call yourself my friend?" he gasped, clutching at his chest. "Not if I can help it. I come here in the middle of the day, out of nothing more than the goodness of my own heart, and listen to you whine and moan about Granger as if we were back in potions class, and you try to knock me on the floor?" Theo had a rather impressive flair for the dramatics, and coming from Draco, that was really saying something. "You haven't even asked me how the interview went." Oh shit, he hadn't. "Fuck, I'm sorry," Draco said, finally putting his fork down and giving him his full attention. "How did your interview go?" "Terribly," he huffed, lighting his cigarette. Draco's eye twitched as the smoke filled the room. "I don't want to talk about it. But you just... please respect my wishes." Draco picked up his fork again, stabbing at his lunch with more vigor than it required. "I'll never mention it again." I believe her phrasing was, "It just wouldn't be comforting to the patients if they knew about your sordid history. So much for a fair and just world, huh?" He continued, blowing out a smoke ring with such a fragrant disregard to Draco's furnishings that it was almost commendable. "I thought you didn't want to talk. Are they expecting me to turn up to the bedside in my fucking black robes?" Which, by the way, were rather perfectly tailored, and burning them was a horrendous waste, even if they were somewhat tainted. He pressed. Draco began massaging his temples. "Somewhat tainted?" Theo was waving his hand dismissively, and in doing so waving smoke over Draco's now abandoned lunch. "I don't want to have to spend all these years training just to end up pushing papers. No offense, mate." "Some taken," he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Beside, I'm not pushing papers anymore. Have you applied anywhere else?" "What exactly are you doing now?" Theo narrowed his eyes on him, a smug little smile playing on his smug little mouth. "Other than tripping yourself over to give Golden Girl apologies she doesn't want to hear." Nice dry knot. Theo pursed his lips, and his eyes flickered with guilt. Draco knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth to say it. "You know, a reference would go a long way." "I'm not asking Granger to write you a reference," he snapped. "You know, they have a wing named after her and her pals in St. Mungo's. I'd be hired on the spot," Theo argued, leaning forward with such genuine hope in his eyes that it made Draco feel ill. "I'm a good healer. You know I am. Can't you just ask?" "Oh, yes. I can picture how well that would go. Granger, I am aware you have already spared me from Azkaban, and surely regret it at every social function we attend. But please, can you find it in that insane schedule of yours to write a glowing letter of recommendation for one of my old Death Eater pals to become a healer at the country's largest hospital? No, you won't remember him. You'll just have to take my word for it. The man who spent his youth throwing slurs at you and watched his aunt torture you." Theo stared at Draco, unblinking. Draco stared back, unnerved. "It's a shame," Theo finally said, "that you're still expecting the worst from her." That was enough to rattle Draco free of his glare. The words landed in his stomach like lead. "That is quite literally the opposite of what I am expecting." Theo shook his head sadly and mumbled, "If she thought any of that shit about you, she'd have scraped the whole project before asking for your help with it." Draco chuckled, though it sounded forced, unnatural. "That is how I know you don't know her." But there was some truth to what Theo had said, wasn't there? She'd held, after all, a warm and friendly presence throughout the week. She'd included him, making sure he knew he was an integral part of what they were trying to achieve, not just an outsourced body. He'd spent his entire youth as nothing more than cannon fodder. This was the first time in his life someone had given him a role that mattered. She'd never spat anything as vile to Draco as he spat at himself, as he'd spat once at her. Which is exactly why he would not ask. She'd said yes, she'd asked to meet Theo and see how brilliant he is. She'd write the world's most glowing recommendation and hand-deliver it to the chairman of the hospital herself. She'd stand there and tap her foot until the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. Theo would get the job he deserved. He'd save lives. He'd help people. And Draco would owe Hermione Granger another unsurmountable debt. He already owed her so many. I'm not asking, he concluded. Fine, Theo groaned and pulled out another cigarette. Then I'll stay here and make sure the smell of tobacco never leaves your curtains. Draco turned back to his lunch, wishing it was baklava. And that's the end of chapter 5.